grab your Great Lakes potato chips and Dad's old-fashioned root beer, 'cause we're going on a mysterious trip through the great Midwest. December 2nd, 1902, Crookston, Minnesota. 21-year-old Gertrude Straussburger would get together with some of her friends from around town to have a skating party at a local river. Now Gertrude was the daughter of an architect that lived in town, and she was what you would call middle class. Her life up to this point was typical of most Midwestern girls, except for one thing. She had suffered at least one tragic event in her life when, a couple of years prior, her fiancé would die suddenly, leaving her devastated. However, with time and spiritualism, which she now took an interest in, she would eventually begin to recover from her loss, even believing her fiancé was still alive in spirit. She would eventually grow back into the happy-go-lucky girl she had been before the tragic loss. But today, Gertrude was acting a bit strange. After skating with friends for a while, who all stated she looked happy and upbeat at first, would suddenly tell one girlfriend she felt weird because she had been hearing music and a voice that she believed came from a great distance, more specifically, that of her recently deceased fiancé named Will, and he was calling for her, and she felt like she must go to him. And unsurprisingly, her friend was kind of freaked out and didn't know what to say or how to take that statement. But luckily, another friend skated up to change the subject and break the tension, as this friend proposed that all of the girls go for a race around a bend in the river, which was about a quarter of a mile away. Gertrude, who was now overcome with this strong sense of emotions, declined her friend's offer and stated she was a little tired and would instead remain on the log by the river, where she would watch the finish line and act as judge of the race. Meanwhile, one of the local boys who had came to skate with them began collecting some sticks to build a little fire for her to warm her hands while she watched, and everyone skated off around the bend to the starting line, where the race then began, and they rushed back to where Gertrude was sitting at the finish line. In terms of time, it was less than 5 minutes, but strangely, as they returned and finished the race, they noticed Gertrude was no longer sitting on the log. Perplexed, they would skate over to the log on the riverbank where she had been sitting and found one of her gloves, and when picked up, it was still warm where she had been holding her hands over the fire. Her friends, knowing that it had been less than 5 minutes, assumed she had to be nearby, but Gertrude didn't reply to anyone's calls. Fearing the worst, they went back to town to tell authorities, who quickly organized a search party to find the young lady. But right from the beginning, everyone was confused. Not only had she vanished within 5 minutes, but she had left no footprints in the snow showing which direction she had went. In fact, there were only 3 sets of footprints. 2 of these came from Gertrude and her friend, which came from where they originally walked to the log, yet there were no prints leaving it. The 3rd set belonged to the boy who had made the fire for Gertrude before going back out on the ice. That was all. There was also the fact that no one heard a sound, no cries for help or anything out of the ordinary. Although it was feasible, during the skating, they could not hear any potential cries for help. But even if they could not hear her, footprints should have revealed something, especially if she had been abducted, which is what authorities first pondered. But eventually, after looking over the scene for a while, they just deemed it was impossible that this occurred and left no footprints around. And using that logic, they also soon ruled out the possibility of Gertrude voluntarily leaving to elope. But that's when someone theorized, what if she jumped onto a slow-passing train that ran nearby the river? But that was quickly abandoned when the men employed for the train, who were familiar with the locals in town, stated they had not seen her. And there was also the obvious. Christmas was coming up, and Gertrude had a lot of plans with her family that she was excited about. But then, the scariest, maybe most obvious theory was looked at. Was it possible that Gertrude had attempted to get on the ice and fell through? Maybe she wanted a closer view of the finish line. Well, that's what detectives started to think. But they would soon skate up and down the river a good ways, and not one break in the ice was found, and that theory was quickly ruled out. They even searched a long ways up and down the banks of the river, and not only did they not find any holes in the ice, but there was no footsteps. It was unsettling. The search continued for a while, and there was never one clue pop up. The city council would eventually offer $250 for information about her disappearance. That is somewhere around the equivalent of $10,000 in today's money, which makes it all the more odd that not one person came forward. In the years that followed, there were sporadic sightings of Gertrude. In fact, it was reported she was found 400 miles away in Culbertson, Montana. However, there was no follow-up to this, and it was most likely false. 2 years later, in 1904, a train conductor in Milwaukee stated she was alive and living in Canada, but there was no tangible evidence of this, and when they did not hand the reward money over to him, he disappeared too, meaning he most likely tried to scheme them out of the reward money. A further 4 years later, a newspaper reported she was living in Spokane, Washington, where she worked in a factory that made women's hats. Of course, this was all unsubstantiated too. So what really happened to Gertrude? Well, of course, the paranormal take was that because of her dabbling in spiritualism, and because she had heard the voice of her deceased fiancé, it was thought that maybe his spirit came back and carried her off into another world. Of course, even by the standards of that time, that theory was laughed at. In fact, newspapers that covered the events later on would state that it was believed she had been abducted, which I'm going to guess they received that theory directly from law enforcement. And if that is true, then whoever did it was either exceptionally skilled or exceptionally lucky to have not left a set of footprints behind. October 27th, 2017, Lake Camelot, Illinois. A man named Josh was walking with two friends through a local trail in this small residential area. It was around 10 p.m. when they entered, just like they had many times before. In fact, the locals had pretty much made this trail on their own by walking the same route over time because it served as a quick shortcut in the neighborhood. Josh, who was the only one that had a flashlight, would naturally shine it ahead for everyone else. However, he stopped paying attention since this was something he had done numerous times without incident before. So he had his flashlight pointed to the left, just looking out into the woods, and it would surprise him when he heard one of his friends gasp. He quickly shined the light back to his friend, who was looking forward onto the trail. He then quickly shined the light up ahead to see something crouched down near the edge of the trail. It was on the left and facing them. But because of the trees, whatever it was obscured by the shadows, allowing Josh and his friends to make out certain aspects of the being. This thing, whatever it was also frozen in place and just staring at them. Josh and his friends, now overtaken by fear, also froze. After a few tense seconds, the friends broke for it and ran back out the trail via the way they had came in. After running about 20 feet outside the entrance, they all stopped and looked back, and luckily this thing had not followed them. But what exactly was this thing? Josh would later relay his story on Reddit, where a more complete report was then sent to the National Cryptid Society. According to him, the thing they seen was gray and small to medium sized, around 4.5 foot tall, but they thought it might have been crouched down and could have been taller. The arms were a little muscular and defined, and looked like humans, even having a hand with 5 fingers. Although the legs were just the opposite. They were partially obscured by the shadow, but from what they could see, its legs looked like that of a frog's legs, while the head was kind of square-shaped, with one point on each side of the head, possibly ears. The eyes were fully black, but they did not see a mouth, although again, that might have been obscured by the shadows. As for hair, they weren't sure. Josh thought that it had short hair like a mammal, while his friends reported they seen no hair. Regardless, the creature never moved, nor did it make any sounds. Although he would clarify that beforehand, they had heard squeaking noises coming from several different locations, and at the time, they thought it might be owls, but afterwards, they were not sure. But if it was the being they seen, then there had to be multiple ones, or it was able to move quickly between the several locations where they heard the noise coming from. So, what to make of this story? First is the alien/UFO theory. Between 2007 and 2017, when this story first made it online, the Mutual UFO Network recorded 25 different reports from Peoria County, Illinois, where Lake Camelot is located. However, none of these 25 reports are anywhere near similar to the report presented by Josh, most likely ruling that out. Although, it does show a pattern of this kind of activity, but if it's not UFO related, what about cryptid? Well, according to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, only 3 reports have came from Peoria County, and again, none of them are close to Josh's account. However, others have tried to connect the creature to a cryptid or alien called the Dover Demon, which was spotted 3 times in Dover, Massachusetts in April of 1977. The witnesses' descriptions in both accounts are very similar, but considering the sightings were 40 years and several hundred miles apart, it would seem unlikely. There's some who also try to categorize it as a crawler, which we have discussed in other videos. These are humanoid-type creatures that are thin and pale, with long limbs, claws, and large black eyes. They are incredibly quick, which might explain hearing the screeching noises coming from all over the forest in a short amount of time. In fact, this sighting by Josh would later become known as the Lake Camelot Pale Crawler. However, the most plausible theory, or at least one of the most likely, goes back to the date this occurred on, the 27th of October, 4 days before Halloween. Is it possible Josh and his friends were just pranked? In fact, it was Josh himself who said him and his friends walked that same forest trail often, so being this was a small community, it's just possible, or even likely, that other people knew they walked that trail, or that even multiple people walked that trail often, and it's possible someone had a really good Halloween costume and waited on the 3 to walk out to scare them. My only issue with this is, you would think whoever pulled off this legendary prank would eventually tell the boys about it later on. There's also the possibility that the shadow they seen just played a trick on their eyes, and of course, the final theory is Josh made the entire thing up. January 4th, 1851. A well-dressed man, accompanied by a beautiful young lady and their baby, would arrive in Dayton, Ohio. The trio would check into a room for the night before continuing their journey to a place unknown to the townsfolk. But as you know, sometimes plans can meet with unexpected tragedy, and that's what would happen this night, as this beautiful young lady would, according to one newspaper account, be stricken with a violent malady. The hotel manager quickly rushed to get a doctor, but by the time he arrived, the young lady had died. The man, presumably her husband, would begin making arrangements for the burial service the next day, and soon after attending, paid the undertaker and left town with his small child. And strangely, the man never gave his name, nor the child, and most importantly, his now deceased wife's name. And since this was the days before hotel registrations, they had no ID there either. This would lead to our strange mystery, because whoever was in charge of chiseling the stone had no other choice but to inscribe "The Stranger died on January 4th, 1851, although, bizarrely it was also noted, she had aged 21 years. This is just one version of this story that leaves us with a mystery that will almost certainly never be solved, because as the years passed after the young lady's death, the Greencastle Cemetery, where she was buried, fell into neglect, and many people totally forgot about this weird story. It would be another 60 years later in 1911 that the story became famous in the Dayton area again, as the papers began speculating about who was in the stranger's grave and what exactly had happened, because anyone who had lived at the time when the family arrived into town that day had either passed away themselves or could not remember what exactly happened to the stranger. So not only did they not know her name, but the details were also scarce. Of course, there is the first story presented, that she was stricken with some kind of illness and died. By the 1930s though, the story had changed to the young woman had suffered an untimely heart attack, or was perhaps even poisoned, which if true, might explain why the man refused to give any names. However, others recorded that both baby and mother died and were buried together. Other sources claim that the mother died during childbirth, while some versions hint that a wealthy lover from New York who doubted the legitimacy of the child led to him killing her. It's one of the oldest unidentified persons in Ohio, and the country, and will most likely remain that way. June 29th, 1985, Wichita, Kansas. 31-year-old Linda Casey, or known more by her middle name that she preferred to go by, Shawn, had just left her job around 3:45 p.m. and was on her way home, back to her apartment. She would walk in around 4 to answer the telephone and speak to her boyfriend, Randall Bobbitt. Previously, the couple had set a date for the night to have dinner around 8 p.m. when he got off from work, but before he was set to arrive, their friends, a married couple, Warren and Cynthia Perry, had plans to drop in around 6 p.m. as Shawn had talked to them earlier that day, and they had discussed getting tickets to go on a double date to an upcoming Tom Petty concert. Shawn had told them she would get the tickets and they could drop by later on to pick them up. By 8 p.m., Randall would arrive and was ready to eat, but instead of enjoying dinner with Shawn, he would walk into a nightmare because he would find Shawn on the floor in the corner of their bedroom, bound with her hands behind her back and mouth gagged. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the back, abdomen, and vaginal area. Her face and head had been smashed with a wine bottle, the same wine bottle she frequently used to prop open the bedroom window with. She had been so mutilated he couldn't even recognize her face. The assault was so brutal that it left the knife bent, as the killer had left it laying behind. Near the telephone, Randall seen a blood-soaked phone line that had been slashed in two. Randall would do something after this that many have questioned, but it was most likely him reacting out of shock. Knowing that the phone line had been cut, instead of going to the neighbor in the apartment below theirs to use their phone, he would instead drive across town to use a payphone at a restaurant the two frequented, and was loved by Shawn. He would then call 911 and promptly gave them the wrong address. He then sped back home and waited 20 minutes, and when they still hadn't arrived, he realized he had given the wrong address. So then, he would go to the neighbor's house to call police again and give them the right one. Detectives would finally arrive on scene and began their gruesome task. One thing they looked into immediately was the murder weapon, because as previously mentioned, it had been left behind. Detectives believed it was a butcher knife from Shawn's own kitchen set, but her loved ones disputed this, claiming she did not eat steak, nor had any of them ever seen her using a knife that big. Secondly, the detectives would state that whoever had done this had experience in butchery, although they never stated what led them to that belief. They also found no signs of forced entry, so they were unsure how he got in. But after they found out from Randall that she frequently left the window propped open with the wine bottle, it was thought that was most likely how he gained access. Finally, detectives made a bold claim. Whoever had done this also decided to stick around in the apartment for a while, which brings us to an obvious question. What about the Perrys, who had showed up at 6 p.m. to pick up the Tom Petty tickets? Well, Randall would obviously tell detectives about them, and police would track them down as they began making their timeline. But let's discuss that timeline before we get to the Perrys. As mentioned, she talked to Randall around 4 p.m. just before she began making dinner, and judging by the kitchen, she was interrupted doing that. However, sometime between 4 and 4:30, a couple of her girlfriends had told police they had called and both confirmed Shawn talked to them and everything was okay. So it was sometime between then and 5:30 that the attacks occurred. Investigators knew this from speaking to the neighbors below. Apparently, the bathroom sink in Shawn's apartment was not used by her or anyone familiar with her apartment because the drain pipe was missing and had not been replaced yet. So if anyone used it, water would leak into the floor and then down into the neighbor's apartment. Well, the killer, after assaulting and murdering Shawn, would use this same sink to clean the blood off himself, which then caused water to leak down to the neighbors. These neighbors, depending on the source, either started banging on the ceiling to get Shawn's attention to turn the water off, or, as another source states, went upstairs and began beating on her door. In either account, the neighbors were trying to get the attention of Shawn after she was deceased, while the killer was still in there. Regardless, it was odd how they couldn't hear a woman being murdered above them, yet noticed the water right away. 30 minutes after the neighbors tried to get a hold of Shawn, though, the Perrys would show up to pick up the Tom Petty tickets. When Shawn didn't answer the door, they would begin to knock on the bedroom window. They felt something was odd because the window had now been covered with something to block the view, and Shawn always left the curtains open so her plants received sunlight. They would call out to her and beat on the windows for about 10 minutes before giving up and going home. Investigators have stated there's a good possibility that the killer was still in the home at this point. Finally, after this, the killer went to Shawn's closet and stole a pair of Randall's jeans and left, no doubt putting them on and packing out whatever he had been wearing because of the blood. And that would be it. The case went cold pretty quickly. Investigators did believe it was either a stranger or someone that didn't know her well, because anyone who had visited her before knew not to use that bathroom sink. So detectives were confident in that assessment. As far as suspects go, if you are a follower of true crime even a little, you will know the name BTK, Dennis Rader, who killed at least 10 people and lived in Wichita at this time. Actually, just 2 months prior to Shawn's murder, a 53-year-old woman, Maureen Hedge, was killed by Rader, and she lived about 20 minutes away from Shawn. Even more frightening, Rader himself lived only 15 minutes from Shawn. And the similarities of the murders were also a red flag, as Rader was known to get into people's homes without actually breaking or forcing his way in. He also obviously liked to bind his victims and torture them, much like Shawn had been done. And then there was the fact he liked to stalk his victims, which played into the location of Shawn's home being so close, or the fact that Rader had worked as a butcher, just like detectives said the person responsible for this murder had experience in butchery. The similarity stood out so much that even right after the murder, people already began suggesting that Shawn was a victim of the BTK killer. But detectives dismissed this almost right away, and they never explained why. But the public did not believe them, and still continued to believe the BTK must be responsible. Even in books and many articles over the years detailing his reign of terror, Linda Shawn Casey was always listed as a suspected victim of BTK, in spite of the fact that police stated she wasn't one. And investigators must have knew something, because although DNA wasn't used in the 80s like it is now, there was some collected from the murder scene of Shawn, and although police have never stated they used it to rule out Dennis Rader, they have stated the DNA matches no one on record, thereby ruling him out. But it has opened up another theory that 2 serial killers were operating in and around the Wichita area at that time, and the other one did not have the constant need for attention like Rader, and because of that, he never played games with the police and was never apprehended. Of course, it could be someone that was known to Shawn and had stalked her for a while before attacking. One thing's for certain, the BTK killings sure took up a lot of media attention and resources of the police, which Shawn never received. In 2019, Wichita police confirmed that after 3 decades, they have no suspect or persons of interest in her case, making it one of the oldest cold cases in Kansas. However, with the DNA, one would have to think a break will eventually come. The Mothman is a cryptid that, although I have an open mind, is one I just can't really get behind. As popular as it is, I have always seen it as one of the less likely cryptids to exist, even putting me at odds with a friend who believes Mothman is more feasible than Sasquatch. This friend, you know who you are, and I still think you're wrong. However, Mothman, who was originally seen in West Virginia, has actually had a ton of recent sightings in a location nowhere near similar to its mountainous home, as now, the Mothman is mostly a Chicago phenomenon. And like I mentioned, I don't buy into it really, but just the sheer amount of sightings that have occurred since 2011 going up until just recently makes it hard to cast doubt on. Although there was an original sighting that took place in the 50s, I'm not really concerned about it since it was just a one-off. I want to look to 2011, when a time I would call the new Mothman sightings began. The first sighting was captured by a man taking a photo of a local landmark, which, when the photo was enlarged, he would see this thing flying above. The witness stated he was taking a photo of a giant Indian advertisement piece on top of a tobacco store. He would recall as a kid being on a bus when he seen 3 teenage girls standing on the sidewalk pointing to something in the sky. That day, He was standing in the same spot as those girls, and it was then that he caught this photo. It was around 2 p.m., and he claimed it was something like a bird or giant bat, although some have speculated it was just a butterfly going through as the photo was taken, which explained why he didn't notice it flying by when he took the pic. Not long after this was the second report, which involved a couple of roommates that had just gotten back to their apartment after a night of drinking, when one of these girls would begin screaming. The other girl ran down to see her young roommate cowering in the corner, saying something was looking at her in the window, but her friend didn't see anything and asked if she was sure something was out there. About 20 minutes later, she calmed down and explained what happened. While getting dressed, she saw a pair of orange eyes staring at her from the window. These eyes were that of some kind of creature that she felt was preying on her, like an eagle on a rabbit. And if you're thinking it was just some perv watching her change clothes, well, this was 30 feet high, and no way someone could have climbed up. Her roommate tried comforting her and told her she most likely seen an optical illusion. About that time, the phone rang, so she told the girl who was shook up she was going to answer the phone and would be right back. When she answered, it was her boyfriend, and he was talking super fast as if he was out of breath. So now here she was, trying to get him to calm down, and as she walked by her bedroom door, she now seen this same creature that had frightened her roommate, but this time outside her window, staring at her with those same glowing red eyes. She froze up and then screamed, which of course caused her boyfriend to get worried. Since he was already on his way there, he sped up and made it quickly to check on her. When she told him what had happened, he would explain that he and his buddy, on their way to her apartment, had also seen a large bat with glowing eyes perched on top of a basketball hoop in the park. After seeing them, he lifted up into the air with an audible shoosh. It was about 6 to 7 foot tall, dark gray to black, with eyes that glowed like embers. Just 2 weeks after this, another man reported him and his girlfriend were walking towards a park near campus when a group of people on the sidewalk caught their attention. These 4 to 5 individuals were looking at something in the air, so the couple stopped and looked, and they seen what they described as a man with wings. It was about 10 feet above them and looked like a sugar glider, an animal in Tasmania where the witness was from. The eyes he reported glowed red, and he seen it about a total of 4 seconds before it flew off. These were the 3 original reports that kicked everything off. Over the next 6 years, 14 reports would come in, but it's in 2017 when the thing got cited constantly, with 128 sightings between 2017 and 2024. 50 of these alone come in 2017, and obviously, I can't go into each one of them, but it's the sheer number of reported sightings that make it somewhat believable. As of this recording, the last report came on April 29th, 2024, when a man named Matt Sexton, a semi-driver, going over a small bridge that crossed a creek, saw this being come up from under the bridge, swoop down, and almost hit his windshield, causing him to swerve over into the oncoming lane and hit the gravel. He sat there a minute gaining his composure since there was no traffic coming. He then claimed it buzzed over his hood about 35 yards up. He hit the gas trying to get away, but the creature stayed with him. That's when he did like any good truck driver does and pulled out his pistol and fired 7 to 8 rounds at it. And he wasn't sure if he hit it, but it did fly off into the darkness. Matt Sexton would then post a photo which showed an indentation in the roof where he stated something had dropped onto it. He later stated what he seen was biological in nature, and he did not see glowing red eyes or any other paranormal qualities. Although, I should point out with this last witness, this was his 3rd encounter with the being, which could lead to a little doubt. But even if he was exaggerating or just lying about the encounter, it doesn't explain away the numerous other amount of reports since 2011 and especially since 2017. However, there are the more rational explanations, like that of a large bird, maybe a heron, or a crane, or possibly just a huge owl. If you remember, we covered a cryptid called Big Hoot, which was really just an owl of an extraordinary size in West Virginia that many think is what people seen at the first Mothman sighting. Could that be the same situation here? Others, of course, speculate that the original stories in 2011 were nothing more than hoaxes, or a prankster using costumes and drones to create the illusion of a winged creature, and the stories caught on, and by 2017, a mix of other hoaxers as well as mass hysteria led to all these sightings. But going back to the bird route, you also get the theory that it could be pterodactyls or thunderbirds. Others of course believe it's a paranormal entity, while others think it is truly an undiscovered, undocumented animal. The mid-1870s, Deadwood, South Dakota. A man named John Hurley would walk into town seeking his fame and fortune during the peak of the Black Hills Gold Rush. After its discovery in 1874, John, who walked with a noticeable limp, would make his way to Castle Creek, where he would spend some time prospecting for gold, and would ultimately fail in attaining any. Unsuccessful and running out of money, he had little choice but to look for another line of work, which he did, finding employment as a Custer County deputy, before quitting this and later taking a job as a bookkeeper. But things would take a strange turn for John, because it wasn't long after that wanted posters with his face and real name would start popping up in the area. That's right, the name John Hurley was an alias, and Cornelius Donahue, or as people knew him in Texas, Lame Johnny, because of his bum leg, was actually a wanted horse thief that had fled Texas years ago. Lame Johnny would have no choice but to flee, leaving the Deadwood area and before long joining another gang where he began stealing horses and robbing stagecoaches. And because of the gold in the area, stagecoach robbing could be very lucrative. In fact, one mining company knew the risk and to protect their investments took elaborate precautions. They worked with a manufacturer who created a special steel-lined coach which featured portholes through which the armed guards could shoot at robbers. Inside was an iron safe, which supposedly could not be opened in less than 6 days without the knowledge of the combination. It was very sophisticated for the time. Obviously, this bank on wheels, which they named the Monitor, was very tempting to any outlaw in the area, but none would try, in spite of the fact that it made weekly treasure runs to Cheyenne. Until, that is, September 26, 1878. As the Monitor made its way to the Canyon Springs station, the guards had no way of knowing that a group of outlaws had already showed up beforehand and abducted the station attendant and locked him away in another room. And as the guards pulled up, they were a little confused to see the station was unattended. The driver, a Gene Barnett, and another guard, Gail Hill, jumped out to investigate and were ambushed. When it was all said and done, one passenger was dead, along with one outlaw. The gang then ended up having very little difficulty actually getting into the safe, where they stole close to $4 million worth in today's money. This was currency, diamonds, jewelry, 700 pounds of gold dust, nuggets, and bullion. They would load this into another wagon and flee. Meanwhile, when the Monitor didn't arrive to its next stop, a relief group was sent out to investigate, and they came across one of the surviving guards who had borrowed a horse to ride out and notify everyone. The group then made their way back to the stagecoach, which was obviously empty by this point, but they did find the other guards and employees gagged and bound to trees. They also released the station attendant that had been locked away in another room. Before long, a large reward was placed on the men's heads, and within a month, 60% of the treasure had been recovered, although 2 huge gold bars were still missing. But what does this have to do with our man, Lame Johnny, and where is the mystery? Well, see, the mining company hired a detective named Frank Whispering Smith, and Smith believed that the one man that was responsible for this heist was Lame Johnny. And it took almost a year, but he found Lame Johnny in July of 1879, involved in his usual horse thieving schemes. He then arrested him and sent him back to Deadwood to stand trial for robbing the Monitor of all of its gold, even though there was no proof he was behind it. And they didn't take any chances either, handcuffing him and putting him in leg irons riveted to a metal plate that was attached to the bottom of the stagecoach. He was then placed under watch by 2 sharpshooters and Frank Smith as they made their long journey back to Deadwood. However, Johnny would never make it back, neither did the stagecoach he was riding in. Authorities at first thought his outlaw buddies rescued him, but when they sent a party out to look for him and the stagecoach, they found Lame Johnny hanging from a tree. He had been lynched by a vigilante party, and just how they did this is a mystery unto itself. Smith had been killed, and the two sharpshooters assigned to guard Johnny never really had a good explanation as to how the vigilantes overpowered them. But that's because these so-called vigilantes were not actually vigilantes, but outlaws who had just planned on killing lame Johnny if he would not tell them where he had hid those two large bars of gold. Johnny either would not or could not provide that information, because the outlaws would pry him out of the metal plate from the floor, drag Johnny out to a nearby elm tree, and hang him. This area today is named Lame Johnny Creek for that reason. Years would pass, and some would question if Johnny was even responsible, as he was more known as being a simple horse thief that wasn't really capable of planning a heist as sophisticated as the one that stole $4 million worth of assorted gold and treasure from the Monitor. Many actually believed a scout that had worked for George Custer, a man named Charles Carey, was responsible. He too would eventually be hanged without revealing the location of the gold bars. Regardless, this isn't one of those lost gold urban legends, because it's agreed on by mostly everyone that 1, 400 pounds of gold from the Deadwood mine was stolen from the Monitor that day, and 2, it was never fully recovered and is presumably still hidden in the area. In fact, authorities would spend the following decade searching for the gold, and just a little over 20 years later, around 1908, one gold bar was found in a dry creek bank near Rapid City. Treasure hunters still search to this day. Estimates vary on how much is still waiting to be found, with some putting it around $100,000, while other estimates put it closer to $2 million. But if Johnny was responsible, the outlaws did themselves no favors by hanging him, since he presumably was the only one that knew where it was. And after his death, the trail went cold, but it's still searched for today. Many speculate that it was left in an unknown cave or an abandoned mine. Some believe he even dynamited the entrance of the cave until the heat was off so he could come back and get it later on. Others suggest it was buried under a stream or just buried underground, while others suggest it was really Charles Carey or someone else altogether and left the empty gold cart and stagecoach near Johnny's hideout to frame him. Regardless, if you were going to search, it is said to be somewhere near the South Dakota-Wyoming state line between Buffalo Gap and Canyon Spring. October 28th, 1966, Springfield, Ohio. 20-year-old Anita Taylor would return home from a long day of work to begin her typical evening, which entailed taking care of her 2-year-old baby Aaron and doing some laundry. Her husband, 21-year-old Larry, would then depart the home around 4 p.m. to go to his second shift job at a local factory. Anita would continue picking up around the home until her mom dropped in around 7 p.m. and visited with her and her grandson. She stayed for a short time before saying goodbye and leaving. It would be between this time and 1:50 a.m. when Larry arrived back home from work that a tragedy would play out. Larry would arrive home after he had gotten a ride from a couple of co-workers and would walk to the front door like he did every night. He would go up to the storm door and begin to knock, as Anita locked the doors every night and would get up and let him in when he arrived home. Larry would stand waiting for her to open the door, but she never came. He would then listen and could hear the TV playing in the living room, so he possibly thought she was sleeping. But he heard something that alarmed him. He thought he heard Anita groaning from pain. He would run to another door on the home, one that connected to the bedroom, and had no choice but to start forcefully trying to get in. And he eventually did, and what he seen terrified him. There lay Anita in a pool of blood on the bedroom floor. She had been badly beaten and was clinging to life. She had been stripped from the shoulders down, with her blouse and bra pulled up around her neck, and shorts and underwear laying next to her. She would try to say something to Larry, but the blood in her airway made it impossible for him to understand her. The shocked husband would sprint out the door and run down the street about a block and a half away to a little cafe where his co-workers that had dropped him off had stopped for a drink. He would, while crying, tell them what had happened and ask someone to call the police. Meanwhile, the two co-workers returned with Larry back to his home where they waited for the police. However, the nightmare was not over, because once emergency responders arrived, they found Larry's small child Aaron had also been attacked. He lay on the crib in his bedroom, with one leg broken and bruises all over his tiny body. It was believed whoever the attacker was placed him there after the assault, most likely using the baby as a bargaining chip to make Anita comply. Anita and Aaron were both taken to a local hospital, where Anita was sadly pronounced dead the next day. She had drowned in her own blood. Amazingly, Aaron survived. Detectives would come to the scene of this brutal attack, and one key thing they found early on was a partial fingerprint from a light bulb on the back porch, most likely meaning the perp had unscrewed the light before entering. In total, investigators would leave the home with 27 different packages of evidence and sent them to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, where it remains to this day. Of course, something like this is going to cause great alarm, and there was a massive search organized to find the suspect. They really had no idea how much of a head start he had though, as there were no witnesses. They just knew it had to be after 7:30 when her mother left, and before 1:30ish when Larry was due to be home. They also suspected Anita had been killed by a glass pop bottle, as well as the suspect's fist and feet. In fact, the killer had crushed her throat with his foot, leaving a shoe imprint on her face and neck that showed he wore a 8.5 to 9 shoe. Investigators would follow several leads and bring in many people for questioning, but it never went anywhere. They would actually rule out her husband Larry fairly quickly, although a cloud of suspicion remained over him for decades until DNA finally cleared him. Yet, the real killer was never found, which is a bit odd. Actually, this whole saga was odd for a couple of reasons. First was the big question. Anita always kept the doors locked until Larry got home. In fact, as detectives canvassed the neighborhood, they found a paperboy who told investigators just a week before, when he was talking to Anita one morning, he asked her why she always kept the doors locked, since that was seen as odd back then, and she told him she was worried about the strangulation murders in Cincinnati, some hour and a half away. It was big news at this time, and the Cincinnati Strangler was eventually apprehended that very year. But knowing that, and knowing that there was no forced entry, well, it appeared Anita had let the man in, which is why so much suspicion was held over Larry early on. The next odd thing was, in spite of the bloody scene that had played out, not one witness reported hearing anything. Their closest neighbors heard nothing, while the city fire station, which sat diagonally across the street from the home and is obviously manned 24/7, said nothing unusual was heard during the night, which probably confirmed that the suspect was threatening to harm Aaron if Anita did not comply and stay quiet. But it doesn't explain how the man got in to begin with. If she let him in voluntarily, what was his explanation for pulling out the light bulb? None of it made sense. Although, I should clarify that the doors were not as strong as one would hope. For example, Larry was able to force his way in fairly quickly when he heard Anita groaning, so it's just possible the suspect did too, although one would think someone would hear that. As far as suspects go, there were only two that were ever publicly discussed. One of these was known to Anita, and it goes back to her job. See, Anita had applied for a job with the city's public finance. She, along with 9 women, were interviewed, and she didn't really expect to get it, because quite frankly, some of the other applicants were way more qualified than her. In fact, after she was given the job, she told others she did not understand how she got it over the other applicants. But that goes back to the man that hired her, a Ellsworth Miller, who would be her supervisor. It wasn't long after Anita took the job that Ellsworth took it upon himself to follow Anita home every night to make sure she got home okay. Anita was obviously a little uneasy about this and told her mother about the weirdo, and obviously he was interested in her. You may even say obsessed. He knew where she lived and probably knew that Larry worked second shift, but would Anita just let him into the home? Was he capable of such an attack? That is unknown, because whatever suspicions law enforcement had about him, well, he never materialized into an arrest, and he was never even officially named as a person of interest. Another name newspapers brought up at the time was a man named John V. Lawrence. He had been convicted some 15 years earlier of a sexual assault and robbery of a 20-year-old woman, which occurred just 1 block away from the Taylor home. He had actually attacked her on a sidewalk and then dragged her behind a home. He was captured and released in 1959, and by the time of Anita's attack, he was living less than a mile away. But this too has never been publicly spoke about by investigators. There is one more suspect and motive that would not be discussed until decades later, which was speculated about by internet sleuths. This would come after Aaron, Anita's now adult son, would create a website looking for information on the murder of his mother. It was here that he would confirm finding out as an adult that he had a half-brother he never knew about. Apparently, Larry was having an affair with another woman at the time of Anita's murder, and even had a child by this woman. Some speculate that whoever she is plotted Anita's murder with the help of a male friend, or possibly even paid someone to kill her out of jealousy. Of course, there's no proof for this, other than the crime itself suggesting a strong emotional motive. But as mentioned, evidence was collected, and although it was 1966, it was stored quite well. Some of this included DNA, which is still being tested today. With the advances in familial testing, one has to think that the suspect will eventually be identified. March 21st, 1971. Two people known only as D.R. Clark and H.H. Christensen would play witness to something particularly bizarre as they drove past the small town of Canby, Minnesota. As the two were driving by a nearby creek, they would spot an odd-looking animal on the opposite side. This animal was so strange that the two decided to slow down and then pull over to the side of the road where they could get a better look. They would study the animal from afar, but from what they could see, it looked like a deformed deer. As it moved along the creek closer though, they soon realized that it actually looked like a mix between a deer and a wolf. It was about the size of a gray wolf, probably between 50 and 60 pounds. It had extremely thin deer-like legs and large foot pads, but the body was like a wolf. The head was more deer-like and had small pointed ears sitting up on it. The fur was reddish-brown, while the tail was extremely bushy and black in color. It was described as being horse-like, almost too large for an animal's body. The two at this point were totally confused. Clark would get out of his car and walk down to the water's edge to get a better look, and this wolf-deer creature would turn around and stare at him. What Clark did next was a bit odd, and in his report, he never explained why he done it, but he would begin waving his arms about and screaming, hoping to provoke the animal into moving. But the animal just kept staring right into his eyes, probably wondering what this crazy person is doing. But now Clark, who must have got angered easily, would stomp back off to his vehicle and grab his gun. The account does not record what the other person, Christensen, was doing during all this, but Clark marched back down to the creek, weapon in hand. He would again yell at the wolf deer, and again, this cryptid did not budge. Clark then loaded his gun and fired off a shot at it, and missed. And this wolf deer must have had nerves of steel, because he just continued to stare, never once making a run for it. Clark fired off a few more shots, all seemingly missing. The wolf deer then walked a few feet away, laid down in the dirt, and continued to stare at Clark, who was now very upset. So upset that he stormed back to his car, threw his gun in, and got back in, and him and Christensen sped off down the road. This was the second and last time the so-called wolf deer was seen, with the only other account coming 2 decades earlier in Oklahoma, which is a bit odd in the cryptid world. But what exactly was this animal? A little surprisingly, this account has had quite a few theories suggested. One of them is actually what the men first thought, that it was nothing more than a deformed deer. This does happen from time to time, although being so deformed that it looked like a wolf might be a bit hard to believe. Others have suggested the opposite, that it was really a deformed wolf, but that brings us back to the same problem. It would have to be pretty deformed to look like a deer. Another theory was that it was nothing more than an ordinary deer, but I have a hard time believing that one, considering he fired off a few shots and the deer didn't get spooked. Another possibility offered is that of the Shunkawarakan, which we have discussed in a previous video, which was basically this large unidentified wolf or hyena type creature, with stories of sightings that go back to the times when Native American tribes were still roaming the country. However, the most likely theory is that of the maned wolf, which is an indigenous animal to South America, mainly Brazil. This animal fits the description very closely. It's about 3 foot tall and 5 foot long and weighs around 50 to 60 pounds. It also has the reddish brown fur that looks like a fox, while the tail is partially white and bushy, and it's very possible they were smuggled into Mexico, where they were then sold illegally to many prospective buyers, possibly in the US, or it could have even been purchased by someone in Mexico who then just let it loose and it found its way to Minnesota. (1883), a farmhand in Illinois by the name of William Ameson was doing one of the hardest things one can do, burying his spouse. He had married his wife Lulu some 3 years ago in 1880, and now he was burying her after a death that happened very suddenly. After the funeral, William must have wanted to get away from everything that reminded him of her, because he would decide to move to Concordia, Kansas and start over. And it's here in Kansas that our mystery begins, because it wasn't long after he arrived and settled into his new home that he received a strange letter in the mail. The envelope was postmarked from the town in Illinois where he had just moved from. Thinking that it was an old friend from the area, he would open it and see that it was signed by his recently deceased wife. Like any of us would be, William was stunned. He quickly read over the letter, and she remarked that she was very lonely, missing him greatly, and asked him to come back for her, telling him, "You thought I died, but I did not. I'm better than when you last seen me." William then thought about it and assumed it had to be a sick practical joke from one of his old acquaintances back in Illinois. Even so, whoever had planned it put in a lot of work, because the handwriting was spot on. He even dug out old letters from her and compared them, and it was a perfect fit. He would quickly forget this cruel practical joke until the next letter arrived, and then the next one, and several letters from his deceased wife would show up over the next few months. He was quite upset about the whole situation and would then forward some of the letters to his former mother-in-law and former father-in-law to see what they thought. They would compare the writing of the letters to some they had kept from their daughter from over the years, and they too agreed this was Lulu's handwriting. Yet, they had no idea how to explain it. Eventually, William decided the best course of action was to reply to one of these letters, but after sending his letter back to this mysterious writer, it would return as dead letter mail, citing it could not be delivered to the address. Now, after living in Kansas and dealing with this for 2 years, William decided to start over again, this time in Nebraska, and I'm not sure how much the letters played a role in him moving again, but I would guess it had to be somewhat. So I'm sure he was surprised that after he moved to Nebraska, he got another letter, this time postmarked from, you guessed it, Concordia, Kansas, where he had just left. In the letter, Lulu lamented the fact that William had moved before she made it to him. The letters did eventually take an interesting turn too, when William would receive a letter postmarked in Table Rock, Nebraska, where he had just moved from, which not only signified that she was following him, but she also stated the letter was urgent. It read that Lulu was sick, out of money, and asked William to come help her at a hotel she was staying at. William would, upon receiving this letter, immediately leave for Table Rock. He would make it to the hotel and go speak to the clerk, who confirmed a Lulu Ameson had been staying there, and she arrived several days before William. He also confirmed she was sick when she showed up, and for that reason, she was confined to her room for the majority of the stay. After a week, she left and did not say where she was going. William asked to look at the registry, where he would see her signature, and it was the same handwriting as the one on the letters. Unfortunately, she did not leave a home address in the hotel's registry. William must have felt like he was losing his mind at this point. He would ask the clerk for a description of the woman, and the one the clerk gave was pretty close to how Lulu looked at the time he last seen her 3 years ago. Of course, there were slight differences from aging, but all in all, it sounded like her. William at this point had enough. He was determined to get to the bottom of this. He would make arrangements to go back to Illinois to have Lulu exhumed. For over 3 years, he had put up with this, and now he was about to get his answer. Could she still be alive? The men would pull the casket up and set it on the ground, and it was then opened, and Lulu's remains were still there, just how she had been when she was buried. So what gives? Who sent these letters? Who was this other woman? Well, let's get the most obvious theory out of the way first, and that one has to do with where the story came from, an 1888 edition of the Chicago Tribune. And as we have documented here time and time again, the newspapers in those days not only engaged in yellow journalism, they straight up created fictionalized events to sell newspapers. So it's possible that's all this was. But let's say the account was real, then what happened? Well, it's worth noting that William was a man with a good reputation, and he wasn't prone to believing in the supernatural or things like that, and the whole saga was said to have caused him a lot of stress, so he can probably be ruled out as hoaxing the events. As far as other theories go, some have suggested a mentally ill woman who believed she was the reincarnation of Lulu, or that she was being directed by the spirit of Lulu, or something of that nature, and that this woman doing this spent an inordinate amount of time copying Lulu's handwriting and following William across the country, only to flee when William was on his way to see her, which leaves open another mystery. What happened to this woman after she left the hotel in Table Rock that night? There's also another theory that maybe he was just someone with a grudge against William, or perhaps maybe Lulu was really sending letters beyond the grave. May 30th, 1958, 18-year-old Dennis Batterman of Moore, Oklahoma, would depart before midnight to make the small drive over to the Navy Air Training Center in Norman, Oklahoma, where he had just recently been stationed. The young man had gotten married 2 weeks ago to 19-year-old Carol Ann Holovic, and the two had just arrived to the area from Chicago where they were from. They had been staying at a local hotel for a couple of nights, but that evening, on May 31st, the plan was for Carol to take the short bus ride over to meet Dennis at the Naval Training Center, where the two would then spend the evening looking at apartments. So that afternoon, she would make her way to the local bus stop, where she would arrive around 3:35 p.m. The ride was fairly short and should have taken anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. But just like how a lot of these mysteries start, Carol would never arrive to meet Dennis, which was certainly odd considering it was such a short ride, and the two were both new to the area and didn't know anyone there. The records aren't very clear after this, but I'm going to assume Dennis was the one that ended up reporting that Carol had vanished. Regardless, it was reported, and investigators reacted pretty quickly, trying to run down leads, and it didn't take them very long to find some. Actually, multiple people would report to have seen Carol that afternoon. They remembered because she stood out. She was dressed up nicely, holding a little white purse, standing on the sidewalk about 15 feet from the bus stop patiently waiting. That was the one fact that everyone agreed on. But as you know, with multiple witnesses come multiple variations on the accounts. Detectives would first talk to the employees at the motel, who said they seen Carol talking to someone in a car, and then they heard the car's tires peeling out moments later, although they would clarify they never actually seen her get into the car, so they couldn't say if the two events were related. Another witness came forward and told investigators that it was a Chrysler station wagon that had been seen near the hotel that was involved with her disappearance. Detectives did their due diligence, cross-checking that model with every owner in the state, yet they can find no one driving a Chrysler station wagon in the area that day and time that Carol disappeared. But it's the tip that came in next that would set the future of the investigation, and that to this day, cold case detectives still feel was the best tip. A man came forward and told law enforcement that a man wearing a large straw cowboy hat pulled up in a 1953 gray Ford truck near the curb where Carol was standing. That witness stated the man opened the passenger door of the truck, and Carol would then stand near it and talk to him. The man was about 6 foot tall, slender build, and around 40 years old. It was then that this witness would get distracted and stop paying attention to the two. But a moment later, he would turn back to look, and the man, truck, and woman, presumably Carol, were all gone. And again, to clarify here, he would also tell detectives he never actually seen her get in this truck, and no one is for sure that it was even Carol. but police think it was her and that she did, or she was forced against her will, to get in, which doesn't seem likely at a busy intersection with multiple witnesses standing around. A couple of weeks later, after no signs of Carol popped up, media began to speculate about Dennis. Although police were able to quickly rule him out since he did have an alibi at the naval base, journalists would ask him about rumors that Carol had a potential love interest back home in Illinois. Of course, he refuted all of this and stated they had a strong relationship. And for what it's worth, the night before Carol vanished, she had sent a letter back home to her parents which talked about how happy she was with Dennis. But journalists would dig a little bit deeper and found that Carol actually had been in a long-time relationship with a high school sweetheart named Joseph Pohl, and him and Carol had actually been engaged to be married, and for reasons unknown, it fell through. She then had a quick courtship with Dennis, got married, and moved to Oklahoma. So you could see why the media was abuzz about this. Not to mention, Joseph Pohl had also joined the Navy and was stationed in the Mediterranean about a week and a half after Carol vanished. Could she have changed her mind about the marriage to Dennis and left to start a life with Joseph in Europe? The media sure felt so. However, detectives weren't so sure, and still believed she was abducted. That was only made worse when 6 months later, a manager at a resort at Reynolds Lake, about 35 minutes away, would tell detectives that a woman matching Carol's description was spotted in a white station wagon with 2 men, and she tried to get out, only for one of the men to pull her back in. This happened about a week after she vanished. Several days later, the same 2 men came back and asked the resort manager for shovels to dig worms because they planned on going fishing, although they had no fishing gear. Of course, the strange part here was, why did this resort manager wait 3 months to report this? Regardless, it led to a massive search at Reynolds Lake and the resort, where nothing was found. That would be the last substantial lead before the case went cold. 2 years later, Dennis was granted a divorce from Carol and remarried and moved to Tennessee. His interview with one newspaper was strange, as he told a reporter he just wanted Carol's disappearance to be forgotten. Some sources also record that years later, he raised suspicions by refusing to cooperate anymore with the investigation. Regardless, he is not a suspect, as there wasn't any evidence that was pointed that way, and he had previously in another interview stated he hoped she came back so they could start their life together. Furthermore, police still believe she was abducted, most likely by the man who pulled up in the pickup truck, after he somehow convinced her to get in. Law enforcement's reasoning for this was simple. Carol left behind her luggage, clothing, makeup, and cash in the motel room, something they believed she would have taken if she was going to start over. Others think she ran off with her ex Joseph or another man. In fact, some think this is why Dennis was so quick to let her go and move on, until the media he just wanted her forgotten, because he knew she ran off with another man. Of course, if she got into the truck with the man at the bus stop, he was said to look like he was in his 40s, meaning he couldn't have been her ex-boyfriend from high school. Nearly 7 decades later, and no one knows what happened to Carol. That brings us to the conclusion of the Midwest Unsolved Mystery Iceberg Explained, Part 3. I hope you all enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.